Hello, and welcome to the very last chapter of The Effect. Now, this chapter is the scary chapter. It covers all of the hidden assumptions that we tend to be making even when we don't talk about them, and that apply to pretty much every causal inference study, whether you are using one of our standard designs, whether you are not, whether you're just looking at an experiment. Sometimes even these different problems can pop up. So they are scary, they are something that we'd like to not talk about because we don't want to think about them, but we probably should. So let's talk about some of these things. And first, we're going to be talking about measurement and validity. In other words, we want to know, when is our data not really our data? So whatever research design we have, whatever theoretical model we have of the real world, in the end, we are doing empirical studies, which means that we are relying on data. Now, data is not falling from the sky. It has to be created or collected or something by humans. There is a process by which we have to get data out of the world and put it into our computer so that we can work with it. And that process is fraught with all sorts of issues, which means we need to think carefully about the measurements that we have, whether the variables that we have actually make sense, and also the sampling process for where the data came from. Let's start with that one first, the sampling process. So when we look at our data, we need to ask ourselves, okay, what made it into my data and what did not? You probably don't have data on the entire population of everybody, and we hope that the data that we have is a random sampling of that population, but often it isn't really random in the real world. Certain groups of people are more likely to be sampled than others. When I say people, it could be anything. Certain countries are more likely to be sampled than others. Certain companies are more likely to be sampled than others. All that sort of thing. Now, hopefully, you might have access to something called sampling weights to help address this issue. Sampling weights are something that you often see, especially in high-quality government data sources, where they try to estimate for you how likely it is each person in the population was to be sampled. So, like, let's say, for example, that you're trying to run a political poll, right? So you want to know, hey, do you support politician A or politician B? And let's say that you happen to know that politician B is really supported by a lot of people who are really suspicious of the media. So, if you call them on the phone and be like, hey, I'm doing a poll, politician A's supporters are going to be way more likely to pick up the phone and respond to you than politician B's supporters. And so in the data, you're going to be like, oh, politician B is losing a whole lot. Wow, look at that. And then voting day comes and it doesn't look like that was right at all, which is probably a sampling issue. Now, if you can estimate how likely it is that each group is to respond, then you can adjust for that. If you happen to know somehow that people who support politician A will pick up the phone 50% of the time, but people who support politician B will pick it up 10% of the time, well, then you can weight all these people 5 times as much as these people to even things out so that you are, again, representative of the population. Now, for this to work, you do need to have somebody who can make those calculations of how likely each group is to respond. But if that is available to you, then you should probably go ahead and use it because you want to make sure that your sampling process is not the thing that is driving your results as opposed to the actual data. So that is one way in which our data could be misrepresentative of the actual data, which is if it is sampled in a biased way. Next up, we can start thinking about the individual variables that we have themselves. When are the variables not the variables? This brings us to the idea of construct validity. We have a theory, right? We have a theory about how the world works that we have written down in our causal diagram. We think we know how different variables cause each other. But often those theoretical variables that we've written down in our theory don't exactly line up with the measurements that we have from the real world. Now the question is, when we have a variable in our empirical model that we're doing some sort of statistics with, does that actually reflect the theoretical variable that we have in our minds when we put together the theory, and also when we come back to interpret the results at the end? This is something, by the way, that psychometricians are all about. If you really want to know a whole lot about this, maybe go read a psychometrics book. Let's take an example of what I mean. Let's use trust as an example. Let's say that we are building a model about the relationship between, sociality, how much you like your neighbors, things like that, and maybe your political preferences. And let's say the one variable that we have in our model is trust. How much do you trust the world? And that might have an influence on how much you interact with the people around you and how you interact with the people around you. It might also be related to the way in which you form your political preferences. So it seems like an important variable to have in our model. So trust should be in our model somewhere. Maybe it's on a backdoor. We have to control for it. But how do you measure trust? What exactly would that mean? Anyway, how do you put a number on that? How do you even get it described accurately? So you're like, okay, well, I got to get trust in my data, and maybe I'm doing a survey of my own, so I'm going to have a trust question in my survey. I'll ask a question on my survey like, hey, rate for me, how much do you trust the world on a ranking from 1 to 10? Right? There we go. Now I have my trust variable. I'll put it in my empirical model. I've now controlled for trust if I needed to control for trust. Except we have to ask the questions, how well does this trust variable actually reflect the real trust concept that we are trying to get at? You got to ask yourself, Are people actually good at reporting their own trust levels? Do I really know myself well enough to be able to accurately say on a ranking of 1 to 10 how much I trust the world? Maybe somebody else would be better at making that ranking for me. Or maybe I am better at making it. Or if I am better at making it, am I still good at making it? I might be the best person, but I still might not do a very good job. Next, will people understand the rating scale and what the numbers mean? You asked me this question, rate it from 1 to 10. I'm like, well, what does a 2 mean? What does a 4 mean? What does a 6 mean? I don't know. I'm probably going to do a little bit of guesswork just answering your question, and therefore, even if I did actually know my own level of trust with the world, I might not write it down in the right way for you. Beyond that, people might just misunderstand the question in general. They might not know what you mean by trust. You might have a very specific academic concept of what trust means in your head, and other people are not going to know that. Is somebody just going to misunderstand the question? Are they not even going to know what trust means? Do they think trust means something different than you think it means? We don't even know if it's going to be that closely related to the idea of trust. It could be completely unrelated to your idea of trust. Maybe the answer you get will be more representative of how important somebody thinks trust is. So it's like, I don't really trust people all that much, but I think trust is really important, so I'll put 10, right? You can't force them to not think about the question that way. All these things might mean that the variable you have in your data is only a noisy representation, if that, of the actual concept that you have in your mind, which means that it's not going to do as good of a job in your empirical model of whatever its goal is to you. If you want to know the effect of trust, well, you really get the effect of something that's kind of maybe related to trust. If you're trying to control for trust, well, then you're controlling for something that is sort of related to trust, but also leaves out some of the important variation that trust is, and so you haven't really controlled for trust all the way. That's a big problem with construct validity. There's also a related question here that relates to the fact that we are studying people in general and that people know that they are being studied, which is the observer effect. Now, there are a bunch of different specific names for different kinds of observer effect. I've sort of gathered them under the single umbrella of observer effect. But the basic idea is that people will react differently and give you different data because they know that you are collecting data on them. This could show up in a bunch of different ways. It could be that people have an idea of what question you're trying to answer, and they might act in such a way that gives you the answer that they think that you want. They're trying to be helpful. Like, oh, I bet this study called the trust and income study is trying to show that people who are more trusting have higher incomes. Now, I have a high income, so I'll probably say that I'm really high trusting. That'll help them out. Or maybe I want to be a troublemaker. I'm like, oh, they really want to show that trust and income are positively related. I make a bunch of money, so I'm going to tell them that I'm not trustworthy at all. Right? Or maybe I'm really trusting and I want them to think that trust is really good because I like being trustful, so I'm going to pretend that I have a higher income than I actually do. So this can relate to the way that I respond to a survey question or literally the way that I behave. Let's say you're in a psychological experiment and you see something on the wall that says, charity is nice. And then you leave the experimental room and there's somebody out there with a tin cup asking for money. And you're like, oh, wait a minute. They're probably going to measure whether or not I give this person $1, right? And so you might behave differently because you know that you are being watched. It doesn't even need to be that we are thinking about the research study itself. It could just be that, we might want to answer a survey question the way that makes us feel good or look good. Maybe I'm not a very trusting person, but I think, I really want this survey taker to think that I'm a nice, trusting person, so I'm going to say 10. There's lots of different ways in which people might respond differently because you are collecting data on them. And keep in mind, even what we think of as very neutral data sources like governmental sources or something like that, those are often collected by survey, and they might be subject to these same sorts of observer effect problems, right? If you look at the unemployment rate, which feels like something that just came from the sky, no, they had to ask people, hey, are you looking for work? And people might respond differently to that based on, what they think about the question. The last way in which the data might just not be our data is if we just make a mistake in handling the data. And this is something that happens all the time. Simply making data cleaning errors is something that happens. Right? We're doing empirical analysis requires coding. Right? In the book, there's plenty of coding examples. And if you do that wrong, then your variable in the data is not going to reflect the actual variable you're trying to study. There are plenty of instances of people catching errors in code or data cleaning after the fact. And then sometimes that does change results. Probably the biggest, most embarrassing example of this comes from genetics. A lot of geneticists like to do their work in Excel for reasons that I do not understand. The problem is that Excel likes to convert things that it thinks are dates to dates. So if you put in something like dec-12, it will be like, oh, December 12th. I'll turn this into the date of December 12th. This is a problem because a lot of genes in genetics have names that sound a lot like dates, like oct10 or whatever, right? And so you put your genetic data into Excel, it turns everything into dates, and then suddenly your analysis doesn't work anymore. This was such a huge problem that they actually had to change the name of some genes so that they didn't look like dates anymore. They did that rather than stopping using Excel. That's certainly not the only example of data cleaning problems leading to the data being wrong, but it is one big one. All right, so those are some of the scary things that we might have to deal with. We're looking at our data set, and we always have to wonder, is this data actually the thing that I want it to be? And that's something that you need to keep in mind. Thank you.